On the podcast today, we're going to speak about why nature produced humans, what makes humans different to animals, and also what's the next level or phase of human evolution. And we often hear about this in a lot of New Age circles, but we're going to come at it from the Eastern spiritual perspective. And it's kind of a thing that, especially Eastern spirituality, even Western religion as well, has always been hinting at, trying to get us to remember why we are human. But we're constantly diving into our animal past, right? So we would say, and a lot of anthropologists and evolutionary theorists would say we are animals, and we are, but there's a human aspect of us that we haven't sort of accentuated or leaned into, right, as a species.
Yeah, when you look at nature, like there's trees and animals, and again, when you look at a little bit from like an elevated level, I guess it could be just a natural question that you can come up with, like how did we come to existence? And we are animals, but what makes us different from like monkeys or chimps or these animals, and what's the difference, and how did it come about? And what, again, the biggest question could be like, what's the purpose? What's the purpose of the universe and Earth producing a human species? What for?
Is there a purpose? Is there a reason?
Yeah.
It's kind of like what Alan Watts once said. He said, planets people. They're peopling, like apples. Yeah. An apple tree apples, right?
Yeah.
And so, even though that's more of an intuitive explanation, but like a scientist, for example, would say that there doesn't have to be a purpose, there doesn't have to be a reason why it happened. This is kind of just an accident, right? A lot of scientists sort of don't believe that too, right? These days, because as we dive further and further into science, there's a lot of breakthroughs about energy and on the quantum level and everything like that. But what is nature's, like what you were alluding to, what is nature's reason for producing something like us, right?
Yeah, what was the intention of it? And I think not necessarily nature had a plan.
No.
Just even human evolution itself is, I think, something you could say maybe accidental, or it just turned out to be this way. I don't think nature itself could plan to produce a human being in way we evolved and way we are now, right? It's kind of an accident, but the accident itself is actually, again, the part of nature, isn't it?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, there's, when we look into nature, there is an intrinsic order in nature. It's perceived as chaos, right? But when we look at nature, there's patterns all over the place. There's geometrical relationships between things, and there's a lot of things that you can unpack on that level. But nature, for whatever reason, because nature itself is trying to, if we look at it from nature's perspective, right, it's trying to prolong sort of its existence, and so it's wanted humans to evolve, right? And so we have what makes us different from animals is we have the prefrontal cortex, right? So we have this large frontal lobe of the brain, which makes us more analytical. So a monkey could not create YouTube, right? You could give a monkey a computer and the software and everything, the coding and that, and you could come back in 2 million years and it's like destroyed the computer and nothing's happened. So, but if you give it to a human, humans are going to do something with it. There's this intelligence within a human that comes somewhat from the prefrontal cortex, even though there's a deeper element as well, which we could say is actually different in some sense from another animal. But we have that about us, and that's what gives us an ability to contemplate the nature of existence. It's almost like nature itself wanted to know itself. The universe itself wanted to know itself. It wanted to become self-aware and self-conscious. And here we are, right? But we think we're an accident. We think that we're separate from one another. But this is not the perspective from the Eastern traditions. The Eastern traditions are saying human beings came about because the universe wanted to become aware of itself.
That's a very interesting point, because any organism, whether that's fungus or that's a harmful fungus or beneficial fungus to the nature and organism itself, any of those living organisms, intrinsic element it's in itself is to survive, right? So like even like in the wheat growing in nature, right? That doesn't see they themselves are good, harmful or not harmful.
No, they have no idea. Yeah.
Their thing is to survive, right? So it just grow all over the trees or grass, and it kills all the other organisms. So I think that nature itself is the same thing, like or the earth itself is the same thing. It wants to live on. It wants to survive. And I think that's where role of human species comes into.
Yeah.
And so that role of human species is to prolong the life of the earth itself, I think. And so then what is the intrinsic role of human species then, right? Like what they say 1.5 million years ago, like human species itself was a Homo sapiens that we had like a very similar to chimps skull and the shape and whatnot, and over time that animalistic side of our brain getting smaller and smaller, and the prefrontal lobe getting bigger and bigger and growing, and so that we have the shape of brain today and the structure inside of the brain that we have. And there is that important role to play for the Earth's survival, I think. And I think that is to say for human beings to aware of itself, and furthermore so that nature itself to be aware of itself. And that is come down to the work in the human consciousness then, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, you can look at it both ways, right? Like the Earth, is going to be around for a lot longer than what we are. But we're kind of like what you're alluding to, we're like stewards of the planet. Like we're like, we can take care of, we have two options, right? We can destroy the planet, or we can take care of the planet and we can take care of other creatures. We usually choose the former and not the latter, unfortunately, at this moment, just because of the way society is set up and everything, right? And so, and like what you're alluding to, like that sort of next evolution of consciousness, the planet in peopling wants humans to get to that higher state of consciousness. That's the purpose is a bad word, but that's kind of the way nature is. It's trying to allow humans or facilitate a situation for humans to reach that higher state of consciousness. To become human, right? And to become human is to become a spiritual person, a spiritual being. The problem is we're constantly leaning back into our animal past, and we're connecting with the animal past. So these intrinsic human qualities of compassion, empathy, humility, forgiveness, tolerance, all of these heightened qualities that a human has are not accentuated a lot especially within pop culture and this and that, because we're leaning back into like our animalistic past. So we're leaning back into security and protection, self-defense, these mechanisms that actually divide us. And like I mentioned in Why the World is Always in Conflict, the irony with security is it actually creates insecurity, and that's kind of the situation that we're creating for ourselves. So we're dividing the world up, thinking that this is going to make us secure, but it's making us fundamentally insecure. And it's always been that way. I mean, it's not like it's a new game we're playing. Like if we go back 3,000 years ago, people were still in turmoil, were still fighting. But the day-to-day, ordinary people were still getting along with each other, you know. Nothing's kind of changed, just the magnitude and the size of the population. The human problems are the same. But the situation is that we have this situation where we can either move into more of the human element, the spiritual element, or we can keep going back into the animal past. And unfortunately, the world is going into the animal past. And that's why we see, competition. We see like this game we're all playing with each other to stand on top of the pedestal as if we're the winner. And that's the completely wrong way to go about it. And that's going to continue to create turmoil. It doesn't mean that you can't have competition and in good taste and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But the problem is that we turn everything, even our ordinary lives, into a sporting competition, right? Like we go to school and we're in a competition with other children. Our parents are telling us to be in competition with other children. It's so vast, right, the way that we're going about that.
I think it's so tricky that, like, again, you can go two different ways, right? And that's only possible because the brain that we have through the millions of years of human evolution, right? I think it's a great gift. It could be a great gift, or it could be a great disaster.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that is completely up to us to make decision. But to come up with the right decision also is coming from that part of our brain, the ability to think and intellectualizing things, and it's completely up to us to make the decision whether you want to lean towards that animalistic side of ourselves or much more natural, harmonized side of ourselves. And again, like, we need to remember that even that what's dividing us, and then the seed of thoughts which make us divide us itself is coming from that part of our brain. And I think it is up to us to how to use it wisely. And again, when you look at in the long term, that if we were to, I mean, I guess it's so obvious thing to say, but if we all just, although we know it's better to go natural way, we all leaning towards more like primal side of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
But then actually the result is we know how it's gonna end. How many like movies been out there that human extinction and disastrous movie? It actually could be like that, really. Like, we really, like, kill each other and eat each other in the end. There's nothing else to eat. So that's a very extreme way to put it. But that is purely the primal side of ourselves. But for nature to evolve, for all of us to survive and to evolve, is to go the other way.
Yeah. Well, that's why Zhuangzi said that was a human flaw, the qing. Yeah, the human intrinsic essence or species-specific essence, because we often use it to divide things up into right and wrong, good and bad, based on subjective viewpoint, which again is based on a primal perspective. It's based on protection, security, self-defense, which are not human qualities. They are animalistic qualities, and so, you know, it's also deeper than that too, right? Like, it is that, but it's like what they speak about in Taoism, about having that embodied mind. And then that's when that can function properly. Like when Mencius mentioned the boy in the well analogy. We have something deep inside ourselves that we, like, if we saw a boy or a girl going to fall in the well, we have like a deep feeling to save that child, right? And so that's what makes us human. But that quality entangled with this is what makes us even at a heightened state of consciousness, because, you know, we can have that very empathetic side of ourselves, but we can also think critically and make the right decision, you know, according to the situation at hand, right? Where other animals may not, right? Like if you look at dogs, if there's a bowl of food there, the most vicious dog will be eating that bowl of food, and all the other dogs will just, they'll have to wait to pick up the crumbs, But then they can go and play with each other after that. But when there's certain decisions, like, especially when it comes to primal things like eating, then the king of the castle wins the day. But that's how we are still operating too, on a very different level, and a much more subtle level, where the king of the castle is still running the day, right? And the person who's the most aggressive and the most vicious is usually the one who is,
The game had become much more psychological.
Yeah,
for
much more
human
psychological.
species
Yeah, of course.
because of that specific essence.
Yeah.
Specific species essence.
Yeah.
We have a great ability to think for ourselves, and we can be self-aware, so that survival game, the primal game of competition and things like that, had become much more psychological. And again, that psychological game can lead us to the brighter side, but it can also lead us to much darker side, which is just you are going into this endless whirlpool of gaming, of one-upmanship and winning the competition and all this stuff.
Tearing at the fabric of human society. Everyone that, like online is a good example, right? When people write silly comments or they dislike things and this and that, you're tearing at the fabric of the human civilization, subtly. And you may think just because you're an individual and you're doing it, you're just one person, but you are contributing to tearing at the fabric of our intrinsic unity to one another. And that ought to bring shame on yourself to do that, because it is shameful. We need to constantly remember our intrinsic unity with one another, and that next evolution is there if like what you were talking about, if we choose to go in the other direction, right? So it can be just a choice. And so the problem is, because we identify mainly with that part of the brain, even when we get those deeper signals, like what Mencius is talking about, those empathetic signals, those creative and intuitive signals, when they're filtered through this, a lot of the time people just suppress it because it doesn't, equate to their life situation. And you develop this kind of state of psychology where you're suppressing these deeper aspects about yourself because it doesn't benefit yourself in the pragmatic side of life. And so that's what you're making for yourself, right? You're making for yourself this kind of, you're building these psychological barriers in your life, and you're not allowing other things to come through those psychological barriers or to come in those psychological barriers.
And I think what makes it more difficult for us to do that is also, like, when you actually look at the world, we have to admit this, that it is pretty much driven by our animalistic side. Yeah. I think that's why it is easier to suppress the natural side ourselves than not, right? Because whole world is predominantly driven towards like successful career and successful life, so-called successful. And when most of people come to talk about that kind of stuff, the people, usually lean towards that survival instinct, right? Instead of being practicing kindness and empathy and things like that. So that is, again, to show that is a clear proof that the world is still very animalistic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It hasn't quite reached the higher level yet in greater totality in general. Yeah.
No. Well, a lot of the things in society are based on that, right? Like you look at anything, fashion industry, the music industry, all of that, right? It's all based on this animal side of ourselves. Not all things in the music industry and stuff like that, obviously, but it's all from that protection, security, self-defense. And it's ironic because we developed this prefrontal cortex, right, and in the savannah when we had to survive. So we had to learn how to discern, we had to avoid getting butchered because, a human versus a lion, it's a no-brainer. There's no odds because there's never been a victory. So it's ironic that all of those elements within society now are built in just this part of the brain, this protective and this thing where we're trying to accumulate status and fame and have 1,000 men or women on our arm, and it's all about the king of the jungle or the queen of the jungle, right? And so that's ironic because you're not listening deeply to nature's impulse that comes through you. Nature is always guiding us through us. The Tao, if you will, or Brahman, is trying to bring itself forth through you, and we can hear it when the message is clear coming through us. Call it intuition, but don't confuse us with intuitive error and this and that. Don't be like a New Age person who thinks that all intuition is right or correct, because that's not true. But those messages that come through that are often creative or inspired, that can help another person or bring insight to yourself as well. All of those things, like more of those contemplative sides. And so this is where Eastern spirituality comes in, right? This is where the East have been constantly telling or guiding the world to remember that place. So that's where we're at, really, at this current moment, right? Where we all come from the source. We all come from the source, but we've gone through, because of our animal evolution, and in retrospect, from the perspective of the whole universe, we're still a very young species. We haven't been around for too long. But we're looking at it from a universal perspective or a planetary perspective. And so that we still have those sensations of that animal past. But we have this human faculty, and we know that when we lean into that, we experience joy, love, all of those heightened qualities that makes us human. But we've forgotten the source that we came from, and this process of forgetting is what's becoming our culture. And so, because we've gone through that whole process, and because we are in this process of forgetting, we've forgotten the nature of existence, what the purpose of a human being is. Purpose, again, is a bad word. It's hard to really describe that. But the reason why a human is here is that we're leaning more into animal traits, right? Like, for example, pop music, right? Pop music is often about like just getting chicks and having drugs and all these things that are, in some sense about fame, status, those animal traits that is part of our past, as evolutionary past, right? But our original ancestor, the one with no face, the source, call it Tao, Brahman, whatever you will, is always there waiting in the background. And what's beautiful about the East is that all of the literature and the art and everything is about smriti, about remembering. It's about trying to remember. And see, that's coming from that deeper place. That smriti is coming from that deeper place. When you see the mandala and you see all of these beautiful pieces of art, you think, how did they come up with that? And it's like, but it's coming from something much deeper. There's a remembering happening, and it's trying to inspire others, to remember as well. And the irony is, in the forgetful world, those sorts of art and literature and this and that are really going further and further and further in the background, because it doesn't help you and I be famous and have status and get wealth and all of these things that to the person creating the divine art, that's obviously completely secondary, right? And not even something to consider. If it happens, then all well and good. But that's kind of that forgetting process.
It sounds like a constant battle between ego or the self, isn't it?
Yes.
Like, in a small scale, that's happening in each individual, right? Like whether to choose this or that. Like would you listen to what your ego says, or would you listen to what your real self says to you, right? And the same thing in the outwardly. That would you choose a path of pursuing fame and wealth, or you want to just be a genuine and truthful human being? That's again, there seems to be a constant battle.
Yeah. It's ironic too, because when you say ego, like if we think about the prefrontal cortex, that's what the ego is. It's in this area where you think of as I, and it acts as the ordinary initiator of consciousness for most people. But if we look at it from a Vedantic and Taoist perspective and Buddhist perspective, it acts as a blockage to the fundamental forces of the universe coming through you. So it's no wonder that all of the animalistic art and stuff like that we see in society, and the way that society is created, is just created from the egoic perspective. But then you see this art in the background, or these things that just pop up in society every now and again, that comes from the self, the Atman, comes from that deeper place, trying to remind us to remember. Do you remember? Do you remember? I must remember. And that has to be our mentality. I must remember. But we're constantly caught in this game of trying to build sandcastles for ourselves to stay secure, protected, and, in self-defense against the world. We have this sandcastle that'll keep me safe. And it's like, no, it won't, because you're going to die eventually. You're going to get old and you're going to get withered and you're going to become dust. And you didn't understand the art of living. You were trying to protect your empire, your own personal empire. And so that if you don't know the self, or you don't know the Atman, then you have no connection with that deeper reality, and you won't produce anything that will last a test of time, so to speak. There's no surprise that you see a lot of, like, especially in Eastern spirituality, a lot of art that is from thousands and thousands of years ago that's still relevant right now, and people respect, right? And people understand. If they understand it, they understand the deeper meaning of that sacred art.
Yeah, for sure. Again, like to break out of the forgetting state of consciousness, and to enter into that remembering state of consciousness, is to be also explained in cognitive science, isn't it? In the perspective of Eastern spiritual path. As you mentioned, I mean, in the past, in many other podcasts, that we have a prefrontal cortex lobe, which is in charge of thinking, like making decisions, analytical, and this and that. And we have that back side of our brain, which is more so intuitive, feeling, more unconscious, subconscious mind. And to access that unconscious realm of mind is to down-regulate the prefrontal cortex. And again, like you said, in the Eastern tradition, they say this intellectual mind is what's blocking us to see our true nature, right? The real nature of things. And to be able to access that real nature of ourselves is to down-regulate that intellectual mind.
Yeah, that's right. And because if you're operating just here, you only see a divided reality. But if you're coming from that deeper cognitive place, you see intrinsic unity. You see that non-dual reality, and that's what they talk about in cognitive science too. There's, when you're coming from that spontaneous and unconscious region of the brain, there's much more of a state of meditativeness, of like a sense of calm and a sense of like your perception is much more clearer of reality. And that's kind of, again, related to Eastern spirituality. When you downregulate the prefrontal cortex and you experience the intrinsic unity in all life. And that's what all of this remembering is about. They're trying to tell you, do you remember that? No, neti. You're not separate. You're not divided from anything, actually. You're one with everything. Do you see it? Like, this is what they're trying to guide you towards. The great literature and the great art of the East is telling you that, right? Is trying to remind you that this is the Smriti, right? Because we went from the Shruti back in the day, what is heard, to the Smriti. That's where we are now. We go through literature, we go through symbols, we go through art, and so forth and so on. And, you and I, we were speaking about this the other day. We were in Brisbane. We were at the small little Durbar Square in Brisbane here. And this is what kind of, spawned this podcast. But it was ironic because when you and I were talking, inside the little Durbar Square, for anyone who doesn't know that, Google that up. It's in Nepal. There's a little makeshift one here in Brisbane. We go there quite often because it's a pretty good place for meditation and
Yeah, it's like an ancient style of Nepali home, house, you could say. But then also you build like a temple inside, so it's just more so traditional style, the Nepalese architect.
Yeah. And so we were there. Cut a long story short, there's a Avalokiteshvara right in the middle, and it's a beautiful piece. It looks fairly old, and this whole thing was donated for the World Expo back in 1988 for Brisbane, when Brisbane had the World Expo. And it's interesting because we were talking about the remembering and can you see it, and most people go in there because there's actually no description, unfortunately, of what the sculpture is about. Someone should probably do something about that. And so people are going in there having all sorts of like funny ideas of what it is. And the other week I was there, and there was a Christian group just laughing at it and condemning it, and we don't want to get into that. But the Avalokiteshvara again is a piece of art saying, do you remember? Do you remember? Neti, not this. And especially like if we look at Avalokiteshvara or Kuan Yin or however you want to call the Avalokiteshvara is about compassion. It's about having that heightened sense of compassion. It's about that heightened sense of humanity. And so it's about, do you remember, man? Do you remember that there's no separation? There's no, disconnect between you and I. It's all one. It's constantly one. Tao and Brahman exist right here and right now. But your ordinary initiator of consciousness, your ego, is eclipsing that because you're fully identified with that. And you've built a society and a whole culture based on that. And it's no wonder people are walking around forgetting. And see, this is the problem, because we're in this process, we're going further into the forgetting. And this is why spirituality is decreasing, like its popularity in the world. Popularity is kind of a bad word, but it's relevance, and
People don't know. People don't appreciate it.
they don't appreciate it. Yeah.
They don't see the, they don't see the point of it.
No. Well, look at India, right? Like a lot of young people are resonating with Marxism, and Marxists are totally anti-spirituality, anti-culture, anti-humanities, and they don't want anything, right? Look at China, and so a lot of older Hindus are a bit worried because a lot of younger Hindus are just practical people who just want to, be famous and have money and again, all from that protective mentality, from that protection and self-defensive mentality, security in air quotes. And so, but India's just only a small example, right? Like all around the world, even if we look at the West, like the decline of Christianity, it's on a sharp decline. Actually, Eastern spirituality is actually like spiritual paths like Buddhism are becoming more popular increasingly in the West. They're not as popular, obviously, as Christianity, nowhere near it yet, but they're increasingly becoming popular. And I think things like, obviously like Buddhism and Vedanta and Taoism, for example, because they are not technically religions, they are mind sciences, that's kind of very appealing to foreigners from, in foreign lands from those places. But nevertheless, that's a whole other conversation. But that because we're constantly going into that forgetting, there's no wonder that you can have a place like China, which is strictly Marxist, and they're destroying all sorts of Buddhist temples and Taoist mosques and Muslim mosques and Christian churches all through the country. There's no surprise, right? Like, because that's a part of the forgetting, right? The part of the forgetting,
like that story. I mean, it's not a story. It's a fact. It's fact that's happening over in the western part of China, where they lock a large portion of Islam people.
They're Uyghurs.
Yeah, in an institution to basically brainwash them. That's literally forgetting. Forget about your religion.
Yeah, forget your religion. Yeah.
And your culture. This is the way, and this is what you should follow, and this and that.
And this is the importance of having those old cultures, because, for example, in people who are Muslims, it's about the remembering. Do you remember? I have to remember. You know what I mean? We have to have this mentality of, I have to remember. But they're saying, no, you don't. You need to forget and get real. In air quotes, real. You know what I mean? Not the real we're talking about. The fake social and, the socialized real that we've created for ourselves. And so this evolution of human consciousness that has always been alluded to and talked about is in the remembering. Do you remember? Because we are actually one. There is no two. You are experiencing this reality subjectively because nature itself wants to be self-aware and wants to experience its own beauty through you. And so we're not designing our world based on the remembering. We're designing our world based on, let's forget all that, because that sounds like metaphysical, nonsense. And we just want to forget that and move on and get real with our lives. Like I said, real in air quotes, And
I think what we need to know here is that how the world is designed to forget. This model that we have is only to serve a small minority of population in the world, I believe.
Yeah.
So-called winners.
Winners, yeah.
This system, this model of world is good and perfect for the, let's say, winners or the in a hierarchy. Because like you said before, that people, you need to forget this is good for you. They say it's good for you. It's not really good for you. It's good for that person who is saying that. They don't want you to be awakened, aware, and be compassionate. It's not beneficial for them. They need you to forget and pursue same thing and jump into competition and continuously be asleep is more beneficial for the hierarchy system, right?
Yeah.
So what we all need to understand here is that the model that we have, although this is the model, the only and probably the only model that we have in this world, but it's not designed to benefit humanity.
No.
Like, for example, again, like a Marxist government, like in China in current time, is that they are manipulating people in a way to serve their purpose.
Yep.
That forgetting model.
Yes.
Right? And once we understand it, it's really like it's time to really turn around and look at the way that what's really benefiting humanity means all of us. jumping into a competition and keep forgetting who you really are and follow this path of so-called successful path or whatever, it's not really make you success actually in the end.
No.
Is what's really benefiting for you, for all of us, is to remember.
Yeah. Well, it's like what you were saying, that those who are successful in the world are those who are good at building sandcastles. They're the best at it. And the worst at it are the worst in society, I should say, according to the forgetting model, are those who are compassionate, forgiving, the ones who remember. They're the ones who won't be successful. You'll be at peace and you'll be content, but you won't have a Ferrari and you won't have a large car and all of these things that actually cause a lot more stress on a person. I remember decades ago when they were when cognitive science and neuroscience went into the study of spirituality and religion, because they wanted to understand the purpose of these things, and it's not so much like why people believe, but the function of them, the function of those systems. So they didn't want to debate about like if they
systems as in what, spirituality.
Yeah, like like a system like Christianity is a system, right? Like if you look at it systematically.
Yeah.
Like, so they're not looking at if there is a God or if Jesus was real or if the Buddha was real and so forth and so on. They wanted to understand what the function was psychologically. And the results were alarming, because atheists and people who generally had no belief in any sort of spirituality and were just very pragmatic and practical people, their stress and anxiety levels were through the roof, because they lived in such an uncertain world. And then on the other spectrum, the religious and the spiritual people, their stress and anxiety was far decreased, and because they lived in a somewhat certain world, because this is, for a Christian, this is, we are God's children, and all this and that, and so its function has a big psychological impact on human beings, and so that was very confusing. Not confusing, but eye-opening for the cognitive scientists and the neuroscientists, and it's something that a lot of people don't speak about, because it's ironic, and it's no coincidence, I should say, that suicide, depression, all of these things are through the roof right now, because we're living in a world that's forgetting, right? We're living in a world that's forgetting, and so of course they live in an uncertain world. They suffer from existential angst every day, So, for example, one of the hallmarks of spiritual people is they don't suffer from existential angst, because there is somewhat a certainty in understanding, right? But we've got to even go deeper into this, because you got to go from belief to knowing, right? Like, you can't just believe. And this is one of the things that they found as well, that there's a lot of, like, say, for example, if we look at Vedanta or Buddhism or Taoism, their emphasis is on knowing, on actually the experiential knowledge, the gnosis, right? The gnosis, or the jnana, jnana in Sanskrit, as opposed to, like, I guess Christianity or Islam or Judaism, where it's I believe, I have belief or faith, and these are all, in some sense, from an Eastern perspective, words of a lack of trust, because you don't know. You need to know, right? And so those who actually know, their levels of, obviously their anxiety and their depression and all this and that, they don't really have any of that, because they've experienced the majesty of Brahman, or they've had the vision of the Tao. They had the vision that Zhuangzi talked about. You could see the infinite in all things. They've had that vision, And it's not just something, it's not perceptual too, it's a sense or a feeling, right, that you have from a lot of spiritual practice and going through a lot of spiritual processes. So
it's, for me, that knowing, the process of knowing, it was pretty much been, can I say, so visibly and experienced physically from for me personally, spending a lot of time in India.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Because when you say to people like, that is the truth, this is the ultimate knowledge and I know it, and people come and say like, how do you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But yeah, from spending a lot of time in India in specific locations like such as Varanasi or Tamil Nadu or up in Himalayas, and it's you are surrounded by that sort of environment.
Only remembering.
Only remembering. And when we were saying, when like a complete trust in this knowledge and living this knowledge and being that is from we literally directly witnessing sadhus in India, or like paint themselves in ashes and they live that life, and we had felt that presence of those people, right? And that is that's literally real.
Yeah. It's the jnana, right? It's the knowing, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of religious sects these days are basically bhakti, right? They're devotional models. So you could say Christianity is a bhakti model, Islam is a bhakti model. It's all about belief and having devotion and this and that. But if you look at Vedanta, Buddhism, Taoism, they're about even yoga and maybe even Sankhya. They're about self-knowledge, about understanding the nature of your existence. And again, this is where that next evolution of human consciousness begins, in the understanding of that localization of awareness that you are, that focal point of the universe that you are. You're like what Alan Watts said, like when we look at the Mandelbrot set, the fractal, you have the big pattern of the Mandelbrot set, which we could call the Tao or Brahman, and then the tip is that's the human being. So you've got all the fundamental energy and forces of the universe flowing through you from this, the ultimate reality, and it's coming through you. And so what's more important than understanding that, right? And that's why Shankara said actually in the Atma Bodha and self-knowledge that bhakti is all well and good, you know what I mean? It's all good to have devotion and belief and faith, but if you don't really know, then that doesn't mean anything. But a devotion in that actually is enhanced when you know, right? So you need to have jnana, you need to have gnosis, you need to have self-knowledge. And that's where the next evolution of the human species begins. And that's what the constant remembering is about. The remembering is to point you back within yourself, to turn away from samsara, as the yogis say. Someone asked a yogi once, I don't know who it was, but they asked them, and they said, how do we overcome samsara, this cycle, this cycle of time that we're caught in? Just turn away. You just turn away. And the turning away here is a turning within. And that's what the process of remembering is about. And those who truly remember are the ones who truly know, right? And that's why there's no surprises that a lot of the great literature and a lot of the great art has come from those sorts of individuals, the ones who actually know. And that's kind of like patting humanity on the shoulder going, do you remember? You remember? Stop forgetting. If you keep forgetting, then, it's like what you were saying about the film industry, like how they always depict humanity going extinct. And if we go on the process of completely forgetting, then we're going to completely just become like fully more animal than animal, so to speak, because there's just no way we can get along because we don't understand. Like, this is just, there's no way, right? Like, because you'll play identity politics, you'll play nationalistic politics, religious, whatever, and then there's just no way for that to end well. And so you have to constantly remember, right? You have to remember, and so
when we were sitting in front of the Avalokiteshvara statue the other day, there's a beautiful art that came from Nepal that chiseled into the pole of the old wood,
Old wood,
and
yeah.
all over the wall and things like that. And there's a really beautifully carved the wooden pole was in front of us, and you were kind of saying, do you think where did it come from? Where did this whole thing, the pole came from? Think, and again, we don't know. Like, and then I kind of that triggered me when I was looking at that pole. Like, I watched this documentary a few weeks ago. And the documentary was about to reveal some ancient sites to learn about the history that's like been 4,000 or 6,000 years old. So these people, a bunch of people, gone into Western China, near Mongolia, in this desert. And they heard the story about this ancient site, knowingly grave, and that might be some old mummies might be buried underneath, and this and that. It's in the middle of nowhere again, but it's kind of in an uphill, and there's like a little old, like a sticks still poking out of the ground. And yeah, their mission was to find some things around that area and that site. And yeah, well, they actually found in total like 8 mummies or something, and this and that. But in the documentary, the narrator was talking about that old trees that's still standing. And in old saying, that specific tree was believed to live for 4,000 years, right? So first 1,000 years is just to find its own spot and to try to grow and start its life. That takes like 1,000 years. And another 1,000 years is to nourish the environment that's around the trees. Like, so that let the organism going, and then create the rain, and so that the water nourishes the soil, and this and that. That takes another 1,000 years. And the next 1,000 years is to contribute to prosperity of the other species, such as human beings. So that because those trees exist, so that people in the village can live. So that like creates the, I don't know, fruit or whatever, and then so helps those humans to live their life. So next another 1,000 years is after death of the tree. So the tree still exists after the tree's dying. Tree's death, and then still another 1,000 years, it's still standing there. Still, its presence is there. So, like, I know it's very poetically put about the tree, but if the tree has a function even after death to tell us some sort of story for another 1,000 years, from looking at that beautifully carved wooden pole. What about humanity? Yeah,
of course. Yeah.
That's what I kind of thought about. What's the really nature's plan for us? Why do we exist? Kind of thing, much more of a deeper level, so that we will all be dead one day, right?
No, of course. Yeah.
Just like that wooden carved pole. It still has its presence. It still has its beauty, and trying to tell us something from its existence, although that wood is dead, but it still exists, right?
Yeah, of course.
It's still kind of living, right? Yeah. Just like that human beings would be the same. Like when we are gone, and we meet each generations pass on, it must leave some kind of echo or resonance for the later generation, right? And we all want next generations to live in a better life, more prosperity, and more like a bright life, in a more loving, more compassion, more empathy.
No stress.
No stress, of course. Then what's our responsibility now, as a human species? And I think that is again, remembering process is to go into that direction. And actually, remembering process itself is actually the destination as well, I think, because it's ongoing in its continuous process as long as we are alive as a human species.
Well, what you and I are doing here on the podcast and what people appreciate is we're all remembering together, right? And so maybe when we're all long gone, who knows, this podcast still goes on. Someone listens to it 200 years' time from now. Who are these two nuts?
Exactly. I mean, when we see lots of videos that are popping up, like from someone like Jiddu Krishnamurti or Alan Watts, and they still live on.
Yeah, live on, yeah.
Their message is still very strong.
Because their life was, again, dedicated to the remembering. It's ironic, right? If your life is dedicated to the forgetting, not many people remember those people. But we still remember Gautama the Buddha. You know what I mean? Gautama the Buddha lived 2,500 years ago, and still extremely prevalent in the world today, So, like, the echo of his life is reflected through all of our minds, And that's sort of how, and you make a good point, that's how we all should be living our life. Not that you have to go out there and make any noise, but the way that you are will, if you are especially aligned with the remembering, it will echo and it will reverberate, because it will be reflected in other people's minds.
Like even subtle change in your own thoughts or in your mind, from having that perspective, you that helps you to make a right choice, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, this is a right thing to be doing, or right thing to be thinking, or anything, even in a subtle movement in your mind, it's all contribute to that, to remember who we really are and why we're here.
And that's the key of that evolution of consciousness. That's the next phase of humanity, right? Is that, especially if we're all remembering, we're putting humanity in good stead for future generations, like what you're saying. And so that's just going to take the evolution of consciousness to a whole new level. But if you're resonating with the forgetting element, then that evolution may take a bit longer or may not even happen.
Yeah, it may not make it.
It doesn't mean it has to make it, you know what I mean? Like it will be how it will be. But if you care about what we're speaking about, then you will understand that your life is kind of you have a lot of power in some sense, you know what I mean? Like you can resonate with the remembering instead of the forgetting, instead of turning away from the divine, turning towards the divine, instead of turning into animal traits, turning away from animal traits. It's a simple game, actually. It's a real simple game. It may hurt at the beginning on an egoic level, because the ego doesn't get much oxygen in the remembering, in the smriti. It doesn't get much oxygen because there's nothing really to remember about the ego. It's just a function of the mind. It's not the nature of our existence. It's not the nature of the universe's existence. It's just a byproduct of evolution.
And I think choosing the other way, if you don't think it's beneficial for me, but beneficial for everyone else, it gives much more meaning to it, and I think it's easier to practice.
Yeah.
Again, like this is good for me. That thought itself is very like egotistic, right?
Yeah.
But choosing the other way is good for everyone else. And from choosing so, you are contributing something much bigger than yourself and something much more meaningful.
Well, you're trying to dissolve those illusionary boundaries of self and other. me and Brahman. You're trying to dissolve these artificial separation walls, these artificial barriers. It doesn't mean you don't exist and you don't, you don't have certain subjective things you need to do, but you've understand, you've remembered at a deeper level. And so that's what guides your life now, going forward. Not the other way. The other way has been playing the game for far too long, for thousands of years. And we still, the whole story of the Buddha was a story of him forgetting and him remembering. That's what the whole story was. He was brought up in a world where he could only forget. Women everywhere, all the food he wanted, an artificial world created for him to keep him in a certain state of mind, which is kind of a metaphor for all of us. We have this artificial world created around us, which keeps us in a certain state of mind, where it's almost impossible to remember. But like you said, sometimes the best medicine is just to go to somewhere like India, and then you're constantly remembering.
You can't deny it. You are in it.
You're in it, yeah. You're in it. So that's that next phase of human consciousness, isn't it? That remembering, that understanding, that of self-knowledge, of the knowledge of the self, the Atman, your true nature, which is identical with Brahman or Tao or what have you.
And I believe that is definitely next phase of human evolution, I believe. 100%.
100%. But you have to dive into these mind sciences that you and I are always talking about. The Hindu mind sciences, the Buddhist and the Taoist mind sciences, to get you into that level. You can't get there by bhakti and devotion. You have to get there from inner self work. There's just no other way. Okay, bhakti can make you more of a pleasant person and this and that, but in most cases, those people can get easily drawn into a very defensive and protective and insecure state of mind. And so you don't want to fall into that. You've got to get into sincere self-work, and you've got to lean into the human qualities of compassion, forgiveness, empathy, tolerance, and just being a joyful and happy person.
Yeah. It's just to constantly honestly look within. That's the thing. Always just be honest with yourself and just keep looking in.
Yep.
And just keep peeling away and shedding.
It's a shedding process, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a full shedding. All right, guys. Hope you enjoyed the podcast today. Drop a comment below. Make sure you like the content. Let us know what you think in the comment section about what we've been speaking about, your experiences with forgetting and remembering and so forth and so on. And if you enjoy the content, make sure you head on over to my Patreon or PayPal pages. Any small contribution is highly appreciated. Make sure you go out and check out the new merch if you enjoy it. There's more coming, actually. But have a good day, and I hope that the start of the year has been good for you. 2021, we're all going to rock it. And we'll see you next week.